Hello to all the social studies fans out there. We continue with Unit 3 in this lesson. We are still talking about the viability of liberalism, but now we're going to get into Lesson 2, Rights and Freedoms. So if you're following along in your partial notes, then here we are, Lesson 2, Rights and Freedoms. You see the pictures of different rights and freedoms that we have here in this beautiful place called Canada. All right, and we're going to talk about them today. So, how do liberal democracies protect citizens' rights? Well, more importantly, how are our rights protected in Canada? Which important document do we use? There's one important document where all of our rights and all of our freedoms are written down, and we can never violate those rights and freedoms. It is in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. That is right. You guessed it. So this is the document that identifies all rights and freedoms that are guaranteed for Canadians. Well, do you know some of the rights? Do you know some of the freedoms that are found in this charter? Well, let's take a look. So it's broken down into different sections. One section is called fundamental freedoms, right? So these are freedoms that are fundamental to our lives. And so you're looking in your partial notes here, right? The title, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, is up here, right? And then each of these bullet points here is for one of the sections of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. You can write the blue part here, fundamental freedoms, as being one of the sections. And this includes things such as our freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom of belief, freedom of opinion, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and freedom of association. All that good stuff. All right, next we have our democratic rights, right? That includes our right to vote, our right to run in elections, our right to join political parties, right? It also lays out the fact that we should have elections at least every 5 years. These are all of our rights that have to do with our democracies. And then we have our mobility rights, right? Which allows us to be mobile, gives us the right to move around. So we can move from one province to another. We can work in any province, okay? So if you're a Canadian citizen, you're allowed to go move to a different province and start working there, start living there. And also you can leave Canada, right? That's one of our mobility rights. And then if you leave, you're allowed to come back. And then we have our legal rights, and that includes some rights that include, freedom from unreasonable searches, right? So if the police say, hey, can I look inside your backpack? You have the right to say, no, thank you. That's an unreasonable search, right? My social studies teacher taught me that in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, it says that you're not allowed to do that, right? Unless they have a warrant for your arrest, right? The right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty, freedom from cruel and unusual treatment, the right to be given a fair trial within a reasonable time frame. So you can't be arrested and then told that, okay, you're going to have a trial in 5 years. Well, no, you should have a trial within a reasonable time frame. These are your legal rights. Then you have equality rights, right? So that means everyone should be treated the same. We should all have equal protection, regardless of our race, our national, ethnic origin, our color, our religion, our sex, our age, our mental or physical disability, right? That we should all be equal in the eyes of the law. Okay. Now here in Canada, some of these rights and freedoms do have some limits, however, right? So in Canada, we do limit some of these rights and freedoms to a certain degree. For example, look at this guy right here. This guy is not allowed to go out into a public place or to go into social media or into any form of media and start spewing hate speech, right? Any hate speech that calls on people to be violent and hateful towards a specific group of people, that is not allowed. So we do have some limits to our freedom of speech in Canada, right? And we do that because we believe that, it's for our collective well-being that we limit this particular right, right? And we also limit our freedom from unreasonable search to a certain degree in certain contexts. For example, if you're going to fly on an airplane, well, you have to allow the people who work for the airline industry to check through your bags, right? And also do a scan of your body to make sure you're not bringing in anything dangerous, right? So that's in a way limiting your freedom from unreasonable search. But we've kind of decided as a society that this kind of search is actually reasonable, right? And then also freedom of association. You're not allowed to belong to a group of people that that encourages hatred or violence, right? You're not allowed to belong to an extremist organization that encourages terrorism. That's not allowed, right? So your freedom of association is actually limited in Canada. Okay, so let's talk about the Constitution Act of 1982. So you see in this picture, same picture that you see in your partial notes here, we have two people sitting at a table. The person on the right is Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, head of state of Canada. And on the left, we have the father of our current prime minister. This man's name was Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and he was prime minister a long, long time ago. So, Canadian Constitution used to be held up in Britain, right? Because we used to be a colony of the British Empire. But then in 1982, it was decided that we were actually going to bring that Constitution here to Canada, right? Let's take it here, and then let's add an important document. And so the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was added to the Canadian Constitution in 1982. Okay, so whose job is it to interpret the Charter, right? I think you guys know who it is, right? Think about it. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We have three branches of government. Which branch of government is responsible for interpreting the Charter and ensuring all of our laws and all of our actions in our society fit with our rights and freedoms? It is the judiciary, right? The judges are in charge of doing that, okay? And the interpretation of this Charter is always changing as we face new issues, right? We face new issues with time, and it's our job to interpret the Charter to see, okay, you know, does the Charter talk about all of these new issues that come up in society? No, of course not, right? Like in recent years, Canadians have talked about whether or not we should be allowed to end our own lives if we are facing a terminal illness, if we're, if we're sick and we're not going to recover from the sickness, if the sickness is going to kill us and we're going to be in some, some deal of pain as we reach the end of our lives, should we be allowed to end our lives early, right? Or ask a physician to do it for us? Well, that's something that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms does not talk about. And so it's up to our judges to look at these cases and decide, what does our charter say that might be similar to these issues, and then make a choice. So it's difficult sometimes. Okay. All right. Next, we have Canada's Multiculturalism Act, which came in 1988. Okay, so this act recognizes the importance of multiculturalism, right? So we were the first country in the world to say, in our actual legal system, to say that multiculturalism is important and it's who we are and it's something that we're going to stand for, right? And so it also recognizes the rights of Aboriginal peoples. It recognizes the rights of minorities to keep their cultures, to keep their languages, to keep their religions. Okay, so with this Multiculturalism Act, we are turning away from our history, right? So Canada's history, from the beginning of Canadian independence as an independent nation, the goal has not been multiculturalism. The goal has been assimilation, right? To get all people who live in Canada to speak the same languages, to practice the same religions, and to live very much like a white European Canadian lifestyle. But then that changed in the 1980s. We decided, no, we're going to turn away from assimilation. And instead, we're going to embrace and we're going to promote multiculturalism. And so with this act, minorities are encouraged to keep their languages, to keep their cultures, keep their religions, while also learning about Canadian culture, right? And so French and English become Canada's official languages, but all languages can be spoken in Canada. Okay, next we have collective rights in the Canadian Constitution. So we're used to talking about rights and freedoms in the context of individual rights and freedoms, right? Personal liberties. We're used to talking about that as being a principle of individualism, right? Individual rights and freedoms. But here we're talking about collective rights, rights of collective groups. And so the first one on your list is the official language rights, right? So our official languages, that includes the right to use English or French in our federal system, right? So that means in our parliament, in our federal courts, and whenever you're obtaining any services from the federal government, right? So if you go to Banff and you're driving through the gate of Banff, you're going to notice that the person there says, hello, bonjour, right? Because they have to be able to speak to you in both English and French because Banff is a national park. It's a service from the federal government. Same thing if you're going through an airport. Airports are controlled by the Canadian federal government, right? So the person who's working there is going to say hello, bonjour, right? And so they can speak to you in English or in French because of our collective rights that we find in the Constitution. Also, education should be provided in both official languages. So what does that mean? Well, if you live here in Alberta, the majority official language is English. However, if your first language, or if the first language of one of your parents happens to be French, our other official language, well, then you have the right to be educated in French, right? And then conversely, in Quebec, where the majority language is French, if you or one of your parents was educated, or sorry, if you or one of your parents has English as your first language, then you have the right to educate your children in English. Okay. So next we have Aboriginal rights. That's number 2 in your partial notes. And so before we talk about Aboriginal rights in the Constitution, let's sort of go back to 1876. You guys have learned about the Indian Act, right? You learned about how this was the legislation that decides how the Canadian government interacts with Canada's First Nations bands. It says how reserves and bands can operate. It establishes rules for the band councils. It defines who is recognized as being quote unquote Indian, right? Having Indian status, right? So First Nation status, and has membership in those bands. So the Indian Act comes from a history of paternalism, right? So paternalism means that, in this case at least, the Canadian government has felt the need to be paternalistic towards First Nations, to act as if First Nations were incapable of governing themselves, and that the government felt as if they had the need to govern for them and to not give them much independence. Okay, and this behavior expresses an attitude of superiority, right? So the Indian Act is very paternalistic. It replaced the traditional Aboriginal political structures with these band council elections. And these band councils really have far less power than the traditional Indigenous governments used to have, right? And so overall, the goal of the Indian Act was to assimilate First Nations people, as you know. Well, in 1982, with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we now include Aboriginal rights in the Charter, okay? And so that includes a number of things. For example, all Aboriginal land claims must be protected. All treaty rights must also be protected, okay? And they are protected now by our Charter. Oh, okay, so then that's those 2 things right there. Okay, so now we go into another section. If you go into your partial notes, you'll see that on the back side, there is this question right here. Should individual rights ever be limited for the common good? Is there ever a time where, you know, it's worth taking away people's individual rights and freedoms for the sake of, you know, sort of the collective well-being of our entire society? Well, this is a question we are facing every single day right now with our COVID-19 pandemic, right? In many instances, people's rights and freedoms have had to be limited and even completely violated for the sake of security and health, right? For example, there was a certain amount of time where we were not allowed to leave our house unless we were going to the grocery store or receiving essential services or getting exercise for a short period of time, right? So that was a way of limiting our mobility rights, right? Also, we were not allowed to get together with people from outside of our households, right? So the government was limiting our freedom of association, right? So in many ways, the government had decided to act in a way that actually went against our personal rights and freedoms. But was it worth it, right? Is it good that the government did this? Did it promote the common good? Did it promote our collective interests? Okay. Should individual rights ever be limited for public safety, right? If there's a terrorist attack in our cities, should we allow the government to arrest people without having a warrant? Should we allow the government to detain people without having any specific charge associated with their detainment? Should we allow the government to just search people's clothing and search people's bags in situations like this? If there's a terrorist on the loose, should the government have more powers given to the police forces? Right? That's a big question that we have. So at the heart of these questions is this debate between government control and individual freedom, right? So in one case, we allow government to have a certain amount of control over our lives, but then we always want to balance that to a certain degree with having our own personal liberties protected, right? And different people have different ideas of what that balance should look like, okay? And really at the heart of this is our social contract. Remember in Unit 1 when we talked about the social contract, right? This idea that all people enter a social contract with all other members of that society, or depends who you're talking about, right? Social contract had different different sort of different ways of being, depending on which philosopher we were talking about. Remember the social contract? Thomas Hobbes, he believed that citizens, they need to give up most of their rights and freedoms so that they can receive security from their government, right? Whereas John Locke, he believed that citizens should only give up some freedoms, and in return, they should get security, protection of property. And then J.J. Rousseau, he had this more collectivist view that people agree to govern the country together and work for the common good, right? And so this is really the social contract, this agreement between citizens and their government. And it's always this balancing act. How much liberty and freedom should we be given, and how much should we allow the government to control us? Okay, so one case study we're going to look at is called the War Measures Act. Okay, so you can write that down in your partial notes. Where do we have it? Right here. There, the title is up there, the War Measures Act. Okay, so this was a law that was used in Canada to temporarily limit people's rights. And it was used 3 times in Canadian history. All right, so the first one was used in 1914. So your partial note says it was in 1914. What was happening in the world in 1914? Can you tell me? 1914, what was happening? Well, this was the start of World War I, right? And so in 1914, authorities could arrest and detain anyone suspected of being disloyal to Canada. Canada was involved in World War I, right? So we were part of the British Empire, at least when it comes to our foreign policy, we were still part of the British Empire. And so when the British declared war on members of the Central Powers, well, then Canada automatically also joined the war. And so Canadians instantly became very suspicious of people within our own country who had immigrated to Canada from some of the countries that we were now at war with, right? So German Canadians, right? People who were from the Austria-Hungarian Empire, so specifically Ukrainian Canadians, they became public enemy number 1 in Canada because we were at war with their home countries. And so many Canadians felt as if we could not trust these people in our countries, right? They felt as if these people might be spies and they might actually not be loyal to us. They might be more loyal to their ancestral homelands, even though most of these people were actually born in Canada. Okay, so altogether, 3,100 people who were, Ukrainian Canadian or German Canadian were rounded up, and they were placed in what we call internment camps, right? So these were camps where they were to be temporarily held prisoners of war, right? And then on top of that, another 8,000 Canadians who were civilians, right? These people were not even soldiers, were also placed in these internment camps, right? So here's a map of where these internment camps existed. Okay, so you see that there are quite a few over here in Western Canada, in Alberta and in British Columbia, many of them in the Rocky Mountains, where a lot of people were placed, and they were kept in there until 1920, after the war had ended. So many interned people, they worked on government projects. They built roads for us, and they were not paid, right? So it's pretty, it's an important part of our Canadian history. It's an important thing for us to know that this happened here. Okay, and so you can label that picture internment camps. Okay, you see the blue there. It's good to know this term, the internment camps. Okay, and so of course during this time, individual rights were limited. 10,000 other Ukrainians were required to report to local authorities every month. So there were a lot of Ukrainian Canadians who were not put in these internment camps. They were allowed to stay home, but they had to come and speak to authorities every month so that the authorities could keep track of them and see what they were doing. Altogether, 80,000 people were disenfranchised as well, right? Which means that their right to vote was taken away. Okay, and then in 1939, very similar story happened again, right? And this was during World War II. And who were Canada's enemies during World War II? Well, Japan, Italy, and Germany. So during World War II, 22,000 Japanese Canadians were forced to move to internment camps. Okay, so here you see some pictures. These are real pictures of real Japanese Canadians who were placed in internment camps during World War II. Okay, and here's a poster. You can pause the video and you can read this poster. And it was a poster that was put out there for Japanese Canadians. Okay, and so here are some pictures of, or here's a map of Canada and shows you where some internment camps were. So for the most part, they were in British Columbia, but pretty close to the Alberta side of the border. And so most Japanese Canadians were living in British Columbia at the time. So it was, that's where most of the internment camps took place. And so here are some more pictures of internment camps. There's a family of Japanese Canadians being packed up and brought to an internment camp. Here they are coming off of trucks. Here is their lodging. Here's one in the Rocky Mountains. Okay, after initially promising to look after the property of relocated Japanese Canadians, the government actually decided in 1943 to sell off their homes, their businesses, and their possessions. So after they came out of the camps, many of them came back with, and their houses were gone. Somebody new was living in their house, or their business had been sold off, and they didn't get to keep the money, right? The money was kept by the government, right? And so they ended up with nothing. The United States, very much the same thing happened in the United States, and there was a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment, especially after the Japanese army attacked Pearl Harbor, which was a naval base in Hawaii. So here's some pictures from the United States. Okay, so later on in 1988, Canada's government formally apologized to Japanese Canadians and provided some compensation, so some amount of money, to the people who had experienced forced relocation during the Second World War. Okay, but also some Canadians of German and Italian descent were interned too, just in smaller numbers. Okay, in some parts of Canada, it was also declared illegal to teach the Italian language or for an Italian society to hold a group meeting. Okay, and so that would be a limitation on their freedom of association. Okay, let's fast forward to 1970 now for our third example of the War Measures Act being used. In 1970, there was this organization in Quebec called the FLQ, or the Front de Libération du Québec. And they had this goal of liberating Quebec from the control of the federal government, right? So they wanted Quebec to become an independent nation. And they used a lot of intimidation tactics to try to get this done, and a lot of fear tactics as well to try to accomplish their goal, right? So this was called the October Crisis. And so it really came to a head when the FLQ kidnapped a British diplomat, and they also kidnapped a politician from the Quebec government. They were also responsible for a lot of bombings. They were leaving bombs in different places in Quebec with the goal of inciting fear, hoping that they could get the Canadian government to give them independence. Okay, and so the Canadian government responded in a really strong way, so almost like an authoritarian way. They did some things that we would consider to be undemocratic, right? So membership in the FLQ was outlawed, right? So freedom of association was removed. Police could now arrest citizens without laying charges. Okay, so people could be detained even if charges were not being laid against them, right? So these would normally be considered undemocratic actions. However, many Canadians supported this because they felt as if their society was in danger because of the FLQ. Okay, so we can fast forward again to 1988, where the War Measures Act was actually repealed, right? And we stopped using the War Measures Act. We replaced it with a new act called the Emergencies Act. And so the Emergencies Act still exists today. We don't have the War Measures Act anymore. And it does allow authorities to take special temporary measures for the safety and security of citizens during national emergencies. So that can include public welfare emergencies, such as natural disasters or major accidents. That can include public order emergencies, such as security threats, or number 3, international emergencies, such as intimidation or violence that threatens the security of Canada or its allies. Number 4, war emergency. So it's a broader term now. Instead of just the War Measures Act, it's now Emergencies Act, and it covers a wider variety of emergencies. And in every case, it gives the government the ability to take stronger action while limiting the freedoms of people. However, with the Emergencies Act, the government must act in a way that still respects citizens' rights as they are outlined in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So they would not be able to take the same drastic measures they were able to take back in these 3 examples of the War Measures Act. Okay, and also, if the Emergencies Act is used, then Parliament must meet within 7 days to confirm that an actual emergency exists and that the government is not just fabricating or creating an emergency. Okay, so here's a poll of the Canadian public. It says, if the federal government says there is a national emergency and a majority of Parliament agrees that there is truly an emergency, is it okay to suspend our civil rights? And about 65% of Canadians says, yes, it's okay to do that. Whereas just under 30% say, no, it's not okay to do that. All right, we're going to go into a new section here, which is all about responding to terrorism. Okay, so this is the bottom section in your partial notes here. Limiting individual rights, responding to terrorism. So everything we've talked about so far with the War Measures Act and the Emergencies Act, there we are talking about a temporary limit being placed on people's rights and freedoms because of a temporary crisis that is being experienced. However, the stuff that we're going to talk about from this point going forward is these are situations in which the government places permanent limits on your rights and freedoms. Okay, so these limits on rights that have been created in these next examples, they still exist today. So in order to tell the story, we have to start on September 11th, 2001, also known as 9/11. So as many of you know, even though I don't think any of you guys were alive yet, as many of you know, 2 airplanes crashed into the World Trade Center in New York, in the United States. Right, and both towers, the twin towers of the World Trade Center, came crumbling down as these airplanes attacked them. So we later found out that this attack was carried out by an extreme Islamic group, or rather an extreme Islamist group called Al-Qaeda. Their leader was Osama bin Laden. You might remember Osama bin Laden from a few lessons ago from the Cold War. Right? Remember, Osama bin Laden was supported by the United States, actually, as he fought off the Soviets in Afghanistan. Right? As the Soviets had tried to increase their sphere of influence and expand communism into Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden was a member of the Mujahideen, and he fought against the Soviets. Well, in that time, the United States saw Osama bin Laden as being an ally because he was fighting against communism, right? So they supplied him with money and weapons so that he could win this fight against the communists, right, against the Soviets, which he did. And then many years later, then Osama bin Laden actually turned on the Americans as he formed this group, the Al-Qaeda, and attacked the Americans in the World Trade Center. Okay, and so this began what we call the War on Terror. So here you see President George W. Bush, and he declared a war on terror, a war against all terrorist organizations. During his presidency, shortly after the attacks of 9/11, there was a law passed that was called the USA Patriot Act. Okay, and the USA Patriot Act gave a lot of new power to the American government and restricted rights and freedoms, specifically the right to privacy from the American people. So under this new act, police can listen to phone calls and use video and internet surveillance without proving that a suspect might be involved in criminal activity. Right? It also allows the police to gather info from doctors, from banks, from the library without the suspect's knowledge. It also allowed the police, or still allows the police, to detain non-citizens, so people who were maybe here on a work visa, or not here, but in the United States, people who were there on a work visa or as international students, right? So people who are not citizens, maybe permanent residents. It also allows them to detain immigrants for 7 days without placing any criminal charge on that person. It also allows the police to detain suspects indefinitely. That means for as long as they want, on reasonable grounds. Okay, so many people see this USA Patriot Act in the same way that the artist of this cartoon sees it, right? So here you see George W. Bush, and he's using the Patriot Act to trim up their Bill of Rights. So the Bill of Rights is like the American version of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, right? It's their first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and that's where their rights and freedoms are contained, right? Also, this cartoon also sums it up in a very similar way. So you see an American here is interested in security, patriotism, and personal safety. And so they might go after those things. They might want those things. But Patriot Act includes removing rights and freedoms. And here you see Bush that's pulling away those rights and freedoms to catch people under this Patriot Act. So anyway, interesting cartoons, I think, to show you guys. A similar story happened here at home. In 2001, the Liberal government of Jean Chrétien passed something called the Canadian Anti-Terrorism Act. And then 14 years later, the Conservative government of Stephen Harper sort of added to the Anti-Terrorism Act with Bill C-61. And so let's talk about that. So under this new law, promoting terrorism or promoting terrorist propaganda became a criminal offense, and you can receive up to 5 years in prison for doing this. And under this new law, police can do the following things. They can arrest, without a warrant, they can arrest someone they suspect might carry out terrorist attacks in the future. They can obtain a person's personal health and income tax information if they believe that this person might carry out terrorist attacks in the future. They can disrupt your travel plans. They can look in your bank account if they think that you are a suspect. And they can use electronic surveillance, so they can follow what a person is doing on the internet. And also, we found out later on that the government has also been using this to check people's text messages. Okay, so there's been criticism of this, but also some people support this, right? So the criticism is that people wonder, okay, what does it mean to be a potential suspect, right? If a person plans on interfering with critical infrastructure, for example, peacefully blockading a road or peacefully blockading a railroad, which is something that's happened recently in Canadian history, can that person be considered a terrorist? And does that give Canada's version of the CIA, so Canada's CSIS is what it's called, does that allow them to investigate a person, right? And many people complain that this CSIS doesn't have enough oversight from civilians. It doesn't have enough oversight from non-military people. Okay. All right, so back to this idea of government control versus individual freedom. Okay, so if you take a look at your partial notes, you'll see that this is right here, government control versus individual freedom. So we're going to look at a few different questions in class. And most of these questions can be framed as, should we give the government more control, or should we allow people to have more individual freedom, right? So you can see that there's this chart in your notes, right? On the left side, it says yes. On the right side, it says no. You're going to look at both sides of an issue and decide whether, or decide why somebody would think that, yeah, we should give governments more control, or you look at the no side and try to understand why some people would say, no, we should focus more on individual freedom. So what am I talking about? Well, let's start off by doing a case study. Let's look at an example. So here's the question. I'm going to get you to write this question at the top of the chart, right here, okay? Just above the yes and no chart. The question is, should facial recognition technology be allowed in Canada? All right, so should our police officers be allowed to carry cameras that can detect a person's face and keep a record of your face in a police database, so that anytime they see you later, well, then your file comes up and they know who you are and what you've done in the past. Should our government be allowed to put up surveillance cameras in society, right, that track people's movements and keep track of who is where at all times? Should stores be allowed to set up facial recognition technology so that they can track who is in their stores and also what kind of person visits their store at what time, so that they can come up with ideas of what products to put out on the shelves at different parts of the day or different times of the week, knowing who is going to be their customer? Okay, so that's the question right now. So some people would say yes, facial recognition technology, it should be used in Canada, right? So I want you to complete the following sentences. Some people say yes because of what? What would be the benefits of allowing our police officers, our government, and maybe even private businesses to use facial recognition technology in Canada? And what would this type of person value? Right, so think of the principles of individualism or the principles of collectivism. What's important to this type of person? And then the next one is, this person's ideology might be, right? What ideology would you say this person has? Are they more collectivist? Are they more individualist, right? And then this person might believe the role of government is to do what? What role does this person believe government has in society? And then I want you to look at people who might say no. What kind of person would not want facial recognition technology to be allowed in Canada? What kind of person would want to ban it, right? And why would they say no, right? So look, list some of the problems that might come with facial recognition technology. What does this type of person value? What's important to this type of person, right? Is it personal freedom? Is it privacy, right? And then what ideology might this person have? Might they be more of an individualist, more of a collectivist? And they think the role of government is to do what? Okay, here are some words at the bottom that you can use if you want, if they happen to work. Okay, here are another couple questions. Okay, here's some questions that have been used in the past in diploma exams for this type of assignment, right? Should Alberta have a carbon tax, or should the use of snow tires be mandatory in Alberta? Same thing is at the heart of this question, of both these questions. Should the government have more intervention in society and be allowed to limit your rights and freedoms? Or should people have more freedom of choice and more ability to make choices for themselves while having a more limited government? Okay, so now we go into the next section, which is on e-liberalism. Okay, e-liberalism. So you see it's the letter I-L-L-I, right? So it's the opposite of liberalism. All right, we're going to look at e-liberal policies. So e-liberal policies, these are government policies that are opposed to the values, the beliefs, and the principles of liberalism. So e-liberalism, it occurs when a country that is typically a liberal democracy does things that go against the principles of liberalism, right? So think of Canada's history, right? Can you think of some Canadian examples of e-liberalism? Can you think of some things we've done in our past as a country that, even though we said that we are a liberal democracy, we've done things that go against the principles of liberalism? Well, how about the things we talked about earlier in this lesson? What about the War Measures Act, where some of our minority Canadians were placed in internment camps? Well, that would be an example of e-liberalism, right? What else? What about the acts, the government actions in 1970, right, against the FLQ and the general Quebecois population? That would be an example of e-liberalism, right? So those are Canadian examples, right? Here's some more current Canadian examples. All right, so you can add this to your notes. Let's see, where are you going to put this in your notes? Right here, where it says Canadian examples over here, you can write this Canadian example over here. The Quebec's public sector religious symbol ban. So that means in Quebec, let's say you are a Sikh man, and as a Sikh man, you must wear a turban. Well, in Quebec, it's been decided that if you represent the public sector. So if you work as a provincial police officer, if you work as a teacher, if you work as a healthcare provider, you are not allowed to wear that turban. Right? You're not allowed to show any religious symbols whatsoever. Or if you're a Muslim woman and you must wear the hijab, you can't become a teacher, you can't become a nurse, you can't have any job where you represent the government, right? And so many people would argue that this is illiberal, that this goes against our liberal principle of freedom of religion. Okay. Also, let's look at some international examples together, right? So we know that in China, there's much censorship, right? So this would be an illiberal act, right? The fact that they do not allow freedom of information, freedom of expression, the fact that they have people monitoring the internet at all times, controlling information, right? We talked about the country of Turkey and the limits that are placed on dissent in Turkey, and the fact that many journalists are placed in prison if they speak out against the government. Well, that is also an illiberal act, right? Turkey claims to be a liberal democracy, but in reality, they do many things that go against the principles of liberalism, right? Same thing in Russia, right? With Vladimir Putin. He hosts elections, right? So he has elections in his country, and he always wins those elections, but are those elections actually free and fair, right? In a liberal democracy, we have the right to have free and fair elections, but in many ways, he rigs those elections for his own victory, right? So that would be an act of illiberal democracy. Okay. Also, the state-controlled media that exists in Russia goes against the principle of having an independent media, a media that is free to speak out and to express its opinions freely. Okay. So that brings us to this concept of illiberal democracy, right? So in an illiberal democracy, although elections take place, they are often not free, fair, and competitive, right? So many countries of the world are sort of experiencing this slippery slope towards illiberal democracy today. So these are countries that are democratic on paper. You know, if you go on Wikipedia and you search up these countries and find out what kind of government system they have, it will say that they are democracies, right? And that they have presidents or prime ministers, they have elections. But in reality, those elections are not fair. Those elections are not free. Those elections are not really competitive because the governments might create rules that disqualify their biggest opponents, right? Or in more extreme cases, they might put those political opponents in jail or even have them killed, right? And so those would be illiberal democracies. Then the next logical step would be an authoritarian political system. Okay, so in your partial notes, you have some authoritarian political systems at the bottom here. So we have some images of authoritarian political systems. They all represent a different type of authoritarian political system. Okay, so these are typically the opposite of democracy, right? In a democracy, the people, they will choose leaders who make decisions on their behalf. However, in an authoritarian political system, right, the leader will make decisions for the people and the people simply follow and they don't get to choose their leaders, right? So in an authoritarian political system, all major decisions are made by a small group of people, or if it's an autocracy, well, then it's made by one person. Okay? And leaders may choose whether or not they are accountable to the people. In many cases, in an authoritarian regime, there is no government accountability, right? So if the government does something that hurts the people, well, they're not held accountable to the people. So that means they will not suffer any consequences, right? There's limited accountability. Okay, so here are some characteristics of an authoritarian political system. Power is held by the leader, and the people must always acknowledge this leader. Individual rights and freedoms are not usually highly valued, and the role of the citizen is to obey and contribute to society or to the state. Political participation by the people is limited and often controlled by the government. If elections are held, often the candidates are from the same party or personally selected by the leaders, and most times people are not free to run against these political parties that run the country. Dissent or speaking out against the government is limited. The media, so journalists, news programs, the internet, they are censored. Schools, youth groups, they are typically used by the government to teach the youth to accept the authority of the leader, right? So they will usually use indoctrination to shape the minds of future generations within their countries. And the military and the police forces are used to maintain control and may intervene in political matters, right? So for example, arresting political opponents or those who speak out against the government, right? So whenever you see the police being used as a tool to keep the government in control of society, instead of the police being used to maintain security for the citizens, that is the sign that you might live in an authoritarian regime. Okay, so here's some different types. So in your first picture in your partial notes, you see a very fancy guy over here, right? And his name was King Louis XIV. He was the King of France. And he would be an absolute monarch. You learned about him last year in Social 20. So the first type of authoritarian system is an absolute monarchy. And so underneath the picture, you can write absolute monarchies. Okay, so that's when the leader, the king or the queen, they will pass on this right to rule the country down to their children, who will then pass it down to their children, right? It's kept within the family, right? So we still have some absolute monarchies today, right? So Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy, right? The leader of Saudi Arabia is Salman, right? He's the king of Saudi Arabia, although he actually gives the ability to rule the country to the crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman. Also Brunei. Brunei has a sultan, right? Brunei is an absolute monarchy as well. So we have a few examples of absolute monarchies today. We have other countries that are monarchies as well, like Britain is a monarchy. However, they're not an absolute monarchy because the monarchy has no real political power, so they don't count. Okay. Next, we have military dictatorships, right? So this is where dictatorship is run by the leaders of the military, right? And military leaders control all important government positions, right? So an example of that would be in Myanmar, right? Or what used to be called Burma. And so the military runs this country. The military has established a dictatorship over this country. And yes, they do have someone who is elected to be their leader, right? However, in reality, she doesn't have much real political power. The actual political power is in the hands of the military, right? Another country that comes to mind would be Egypt, right? So Egypt is also run by its military. Okay, next we have minority tyrannies. So this would be when a minority of people have full control over the government of a country, even though they are a minority and not a majority, right? So in a democracy, it's supposed to be that the majority of the people rule the country. But in a minority tyranny, it's a small group of people who have political control over the country. And a classic example of that, a very tragic example of that, it was in South Korea. So not South Korea, South Africa, right? Where the National Party of South Africa established apartheid, right? So this is where the white minority of South Africa ran the country and restricted the rights and freedoms of the black majority of the country. Okay, next example is totalitarianism, right? So dictatorship. So this would be when it's different from a military dictatorship because instead of it being the military establishing a totalitarian rule over the country, it's a civilian who establishes a dictatorship. And so you guys learned a couple of examples of this back in the last unit. So Adolf Hitler is one example. Joseph Stalin is another example. I don't need to talk about this one too much because we spent a lot of time on this. Okay, so anyway, that's it for this lesson. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a few things, and I hope you have a great day.